everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101 for the 28th of July. And what I wanted to do today was to talk about 3 more chapters in the textbook about delivering speeches, culture, and audience. Chapters that I think will assist you with your first speech. You'll remember your first speech, your autobiographical, is a 5-minute speech in which you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and that's scheduled for Tuesday, August 4th. And you have one of 2 options on how to deliver that speech. You can either upload a video for that speech onto our Moodle site, and I will basically take a list of individuals who are interested in so doing. As you can see that I've already indicated that Willow, Ray, and Letitia have indicated that they're so interested in doing that, and I will put up a place on our site for you to be able to do so. And then for those of you who would prefer to deliver the speech via Zoom, I'll also take a list of those individuals, and right now I have Leah. And at this particular point, I'm still waiting to hear back from several of you, so if you could please contact me via email, RUIZ for Ruiz at gcc.mass.edu, to indicate which you would prefer to do. For those of you who wish to perform via Zoom, please also indicate the times on the 4th that you would be available, and I will try to find a time in which most of us, if not all of us, are available. And if it turns out that you are not available during the time in which we have our Zoom scheduled, you can always upload your speech. And then what I will end up doing is having a way for individuals to give feedback for the uploaded speeches. And in relation to thinking about our first speech, as you know, I'm going to be evaluating that based on a template that I have included in our syllabi and other documents section. And that's also in the body of the section if it turns out that you can't open the attachment. But certainly you can contact me as well if you wanted a copy of that particular attachment. And the template basically reviews what we've been talking about thus far in terms of speech delivery. And you can see that we are beginning with an introduction where you are evaluated on whether or not you've got some sort of an attention getter. And that could be just as simple as greeting your audience. And then some sort of a transitional statement so that you can move into your body section. And then in the body section, some of the things to consider are, is your pattern clear? Are your main points stated? Are you developing those points? And are you using well-chosen words? And those are elements that we've already thus discussed. There's a place there as well for verbal mannerisms, and there isn't the ranking of none, needs improvement, good, and excellent that you see in the other sections. And verbal mannerisms are basically filler words, ahs and ums. And there's nothing wrong with an occasional filler word. You just don't want to use them to excess so that the audience is focusing on the fact that you're using filler words. Oftentimes individuals use these words to buy themselves a little bit more time so they can think about what it is they're going to be saying next, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to have a speaking outline so you have a plan so that you aren't left with wondering what you should say next. And oftentimes individuals use verbal mannerisms as a way to get air into their bodies, and that's one of the things we also talked about, that during times of stress people tend not to breathe regularly and deeply, and which is one of the things that you want to do, breathing from the diaphragm. And in fact, I've even had students give themselves cues on their speaking outlines about how to go about breathing. And then finally, the conclusion. Are you in one way or another restating or summarizing and then giving a concluding statement, making sure that you're cueing in the audience that you are basically ending your speech? You can do that as simply as saying something like thank you or asking your audience for questions. And then the next part of the speech rating is what we're going to talk about today. It's about actually the delivery of the speech. Things like eye contact, body movement, vocal quality, articulation, and enthusiasm. And then after your first speech, I don't even bother using that template anymore. I just take notes based on your performance of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then you can get a copy of my notes. So in terms of thinking about delivering speeches, culture, and audience, You can see that in Chapter 10, Delivering Speeches, talks a little bit about some of the different ways that you could deliver a speech. What we are focusing on in class is the extemporaneous speech. It's a speech that's prepared in advance, but it's delivered with a speaking outline of key words and phrases, and then basically what you do is you fill in unscripted material to elaborate on those key words and phrases. You'll remember that was something that the Toastmasters video had discussed as well. The other kinds of speeches, I saw several of you writing a little bit in the discussion forum about the memorized speech, and that is not something that we would be doing in this class. One of the reasons why you don't want to memorize your speech is because you're very likely to deliver it in a very flat manner, and you're also likely to forget points of it. Remember that your speaking outline is merely a guide. It's not necessarily set in stone. No one will see your speaking outline in your audience, so you can deviate from that speaking outline. I kind of liken it to following the GPS in your car, in that you might not necessarily want to follow the directions in the GPS in your car, but understand that there's a greater likelihood of getting lost. Same sort of idea with your speaking outline. It's there to help you, not to hurt you. As I said, I'll be looking at your speaking outlines. I ask that you submit them to me after you deliver the speech, just so that I can take a quick peek at them and give you my suggestions. But in the real world of public speaking, you would never share your speaking outline with anyone, so that's a very personal and private thing. The memorized speech works very well for very brief and formal occasions. Think of something like a toast at a wedding, which is where Toastmasters gets its name, the idea of giving a toast at a celebratory function. The manuscript speech, which you might wish you were delivering, is read from a manuscript or a teleprompter. And I caution you against doing something like that. I've never had an opportunity to read from a teleprompter, but there can definitely be errors that occur with the teleprompter. And you can see in today's notes, I've given you a short link of when that indeed happened with a very skilled public speaker, and how ultimately he didn't know what to do and he ended up leaving the stage. So you don't want that to happen. Usually the manuscript speech, when you're reading from a manuscript, is delivered in a situation when the audience expects that. Oftentimes it's the presentation of academic papers where you're literally reading your speech. The impromptu speech is the spur-of-the-moment speech, no preparation. I encourage you to try to avoid that speech as much as possible. It oftentimes happens in an unexpected way. So if that were indeed to occur, what I suggest you do is that you give a very brief speech. Perhaps you've been given an award that you were not expecting, and then just saying thank you rather than giving a long convoluted speech where you've got an opportunity of making errors. If we were meeting in class, I would have all of you deliver a very brief impromptu speech where I would ask you to introduce yourself to the audience by stating your name and talking about one of your favorite things. And then afterwards, we talk a little bit about that experience, how it's different speaking in front of the room than perhaps speaking with the audience, and the anxiety that you probably felt because you didn't have an opportunity to prepare. And my point being that if it was something that was that simple, the idea of your name and a favorite thing, that could lead to that kind of anxiety. Imagine a 5, 10, or 15-minute speech. So if you're ever tempted to think, well, the autobiographical speech is about myself, therefore I can just deliver it spur of the moment, impromptu, because I know the material, I encourage you definitely not to do such a thing. We are focusing again on the extemporaneous speech, something that's been prepared and rehearsed in advance, not memorized, but you do have a speaking outline with key points and phrases that you may or may not refer to during the course of the speech. Some of the things to think about in terms of delivering your speech is your voice. You want to be conversational. It's one of the reasons, again, why you don't want to be reading your speech. You don't want to sound too artificial. So when we talk about being conversational, that usually means that you've got shorter sentences, you've got simpler vocabulary, you are varying your vocal inflections, so you aren't speaking in a monotone. You're varying your volume and your speed as well. You are enunciating well, hopefully, which means no mumbling. I know that oftentimes people are concerned about pronunciation, and one of the sample speeches that I have attached for you to view, you'll see that that individual does not necessarily have perfect pronunciation, nor does that individual need to have perfect pronunciation. It turns out that English is not that individual's first language. As long as it's clear enough for the audience to understand, and if you have great concerns about your pronunciation, then one of the things you can do is give a kind of disclaimer at the beginning of your speech that, let's say, English is not your first language, and that if an individual has, or an audience member has difficulty understanding what it is you're saying, please notify you. And of course, that's a little bit more difficult on video if you're pre-recording, but the idea is that the burden is on the audience member, not necessarily on you. Because pronunciation is something that, yes, you can change, but it takes months, if not years. And there are even variances with pronunciation based on region and locality. You've probably heard the old joke about parking the car in Harvard Yard, and the Boston pronunciation. And even some words that we have dispute about, things like Caribbean or Caribbean, or you want to think about harassment or harassment, where oftentimes there isn't necessarily a consensus on how to pronounce that particular word. And again, you should be less concerned with pronunciation, and you should be more concerned with enunciation, making sure that you're speaking clearly and loudly rather than mumbling. You can also pause for dramatic effect, something that the Toastmasters video talked about, and also pausing is very useful in terms of your gathering air. Something else that's discussed in Chapter 10 that might be less of an issue if in the way that we're delivering speeches in our class is the use of proxemics, or the use of space. And if you were delivering a speech live, you would see how you could manipulate space by speaking closer or farther from the audience, and that ultimately that can influence how an audience responds. That said, whether you're using Zoom or you are recording your speech, what you do need to think about is what your environment is, and to make sure that you are visible when you are speaking, especially your face, where so many cues are taken from facial expressions. And that's called affect display. And that's one of the things that an audience will evaluate. In fact, studies have shown that an audience will probably pay more attention to your delivery than it will to your content. It's not necessarily fair, but it is true. And if you've heard anything about the Nixon-Kennedy debate, a very famous debate, and one of the reasons why it was in the early days of television, so that approximately half of the audience watched that debate on television and half of the audience listened to the debate on the radio. And the results were very different based on whether or not the audience watched it on television. The majority of individuals who watched it on television, who were polled afterwards, indicated that Kennedy won that debate because of his presentation. It's very suave, and he was very presidential-like, as opposed to the majority of individuals who heard that debate on the radio, and they said Richard Nixon, had won that particular debate because of the content of his delivery. So, and it's probably one of the most important debates because it's really influenced how presidential debates have occurred since then. And the importance of making sure that you appear to be presidential. And unfortunately for Richard Nixon, there were several mistakes he made. He declined makeup. Again, these were the early days of television. If you appear on television without makeup, you look very washed out. And he also slumped when he sat. He wasn't dressed as well as he could be. He looked a little frumpy in his suit. And finally, he was known as a sweater. And I'm not talking about an article of clothing here. I'm talking about the idea that when there were warm temperatures, he would visibly sweat. And television studios are very, very warm. And a candidate who's visibly sweating looks untrustworthy. And this was something actually that was important during a recent debate. I believe it was with Bush and Kerry. Is that right? And basically what it was is that the two camps were arguing about the temperature of the hall in which they were going to be delivering their speeches, because Kerry was also known as a sweater, and basically the idea was to try to make the hall as warm as possible. And that said, they were only disputing 2 or 3 degrees of temperature, but enough so that there would be a visible difference. So this is something for you to think about when you're presenting your speech. As important as your content is, your audience is likely looking at your presentation. Things like your eye contact, which you should vary. Again, if you're working with an audience. If you are looking into a camera for something like Zoom or pre-recorded speech, you want to look into the camera. Things like varying your facial expressions, things like varying your gestures. And we can have things like conventional gestures, which are assigned meaning by custom. Perhaps something like the thumbs up sign to illustrate okay, or other meanings that have been assigned by a particular group. And that said, they can be misinterpreted by a group. So just because one group has assigned a meaning to a particular gesture, that doesn't mean that that's a universal meaning. And that's oftentimes something that happens with cultural misunderstandings, where an individual goes to another culture and uses a gesture that has a meaning in their culture, but it has a completely different meaning in another culture. So you need to be aware of your audience. The descriptive gestures, those are a little bit easier because they describe things like size and shape and location. And that's fairly universal. And then there are also indicators, things like expressing feelings, like smashing your fist on a desk, for instance, to illustrate anger or frustration or to emphasize a point. That said, again, in this new normal that we're in, probably you're focusing more on the face than you are on the body. But of course, you can make decisions as to how you want to set up your camera. So as to how much or how little of your body you want to share with your audience, but you definitely want to share your face with your audience. The chapter also talks, or chapter 4 also talks about culture, which I mentioned briefly in terms of facial expressions, in that, and also which I mentioned briefly in terms of, conventional gestures, that a culture may have a different meaning assigned to a particular gesture. Culture, in the broadest definition of the word, is a group membership. So any individuals who form a group, probably they have behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and values that have some predictive element. But only some, because this is where you get into stereotypes, where you're assuming that everybody in the group is going to be acting exactly the same way, and that's not true. So if you think about group memberships, we belong to hundreds, if not thousands, of different groups. When we talk about multicultural, that means many cultures or many groups. And this gets into chapter 5, where it talks about audience and the idea of demographics. Those are the observable characteristics of individuals. And oftentimes we usually think about the large groups to which we belong, things like gender, ethnic background, age, education, political affiliation, religion, sexual orientation. But the groups can be very small and very specific. They can be based on hobbies, they can be based on geography, they could be based on something as small as our public speaking class at Greenfield Community College in summer of 2020. That for better or for worse, we are a group that has formed a culture, or is forming a culture. And some of those observable characteristics are behaviors, and those include actions. And oftentimes conversational styles, whether someone is very succinct or whether somebody tends to be much more wordy and much more in the realm of storytelling. Well, that's an individual trait. It can also be a cultural trait. I'll always remember my former colleague, Dovia Fessi, who talked a little bit about the culture in Africa and the difference with, of all things, time. And that in Africa, the bus leaves when it's full. It doesn't necessarily leave at a particular time, because that would be a waste of resources. In America, it's quite different. The bus leaves at a particular time, whether it's full or empty, the assumption being that it has to be at another location at another time. So it's a very different concept of time in Africa, that ultimately there is no deadline. The thing begins and the thing ends when the group agrees it begins or ends, and when all are present. So basically, if you're concerned that the bus is leaving late because you need to get to, let's say, your place of employment by a particular time, a likely response would be that that employment will still be there regardless of the time you get there. and that your shift starts when you arrive and your shift ends when you leave. And likewise, if you want to think about a class starts when everybody arrives and the class ends when we're done, whether it be 5 minutes or 5 hours. It's not necessarily a better or worse way of thinking about time. It's just a different way of viewing about time. But culture can oftentimes influence behaviors, and behaviors are observable actions, so those usually can be identifiable. I've noticed that with this particular class, our culture or behaviors seem to be that it is somewhat difficult for individuals to answer the form discussion questions in the 24-hour period. So one of the things I'm going to do is to extend that to a 48-hour period. So now you've got 48 hours in order to be able to respond to our discussion forum questions. And if you can't do it within that particular time frame, please send me an email. I'll be happy to give you an extension. So hopefully that'll take a little bit pressure off of you. Attitudes are feelings, and oftentimes those can change based on the situation. If anybody's ever told you that you have a good attitude or a bad attitude about something. And that's also something that's influenced by one's culture or group membership, as well as one's individual experiences. Beliefs, what we think are true and false, again, can be influenced by one's cultural group, but also by one's individuality. And values, and those are basically the most highly resistant to change. I suggest that they include all of the above: behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. And this will become increasingly important when we start talking about the persuasive speech, where we're going to try to perhaps convince somebody to change their values. And as I've often said with the persuasive speech, the test is not whether or not everybody agrees with you. I think that that's an impossibility. The test is whether or not everybody respects you. And that means being well prepared and delivering a good speech, even though you might be giving a speech where you are supporting a position that an audience member might disagree with. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So, the textbook in chapter 5 talks about hostile audiences. I doubt you'd ever be in that kind of situation. Usually when you are presenting to an audience that's hostile, you know very well that that's exactly what you're going to do. Perhaps you are delivering a speech to a different political party. But you might have skeptical audiences, and I think that many of the same tips and techniques are applicable to both. Now, I can't give you the magic bullet, the panacea that will cure all of the problems that you might have with a skeptical or a hostile audience. But these are some techniques to keep in mind. To try to establish goodwill at the beginning of the speech. To establish areas of agreement. Oftentimes we talk about places where we disagree rather than talking about places where we agree. Using credible outside sources, and it's one of the reasons for your persuasive speech that you will be using at least 3 outside sources. To be professional, which means to be well prepared and to make sure that you are being as ethical as possible. You're using ethos in your speech. You're using humor when appropriate. Humor can be a way that audiences can bond with one another. And be multi-sided. In other words, not just assuming when you are presenting that your position is the only position that exists. In fact, addressing the fact that there are other positions and briefly discussing them and briefly discussing why they may not be as strong as your position usually only helps rather than hurts. So those are some of the last things to consider in terms of the presentation for the speech. Now, you'll notice that what I had scheduled for next class was a quiz and also practice speeches. So I'm going to need to make a few adaptations about that than in the way that I would normally do it if we were meeting in class. If we were meeting in class, that first quiz, which is 20 questions, mostly short answer, but perhaps a multiple choice and true false, would be closed book, closed notes. But considering the challenges that we have, I don't have any problem with you taking 48 hours to do that quiz and using your notes in your textbook. You'll also be asked some questions perhaps that were addressed in the videos. So one of the best ways to prepare for the quiz, as well as really the best way to prepare for delivering the speeches, to do all of the readings, because the readings give you good suggestions on how to do that. Watch all of the videos, because I'm also giving you suggestions on how to do that. And not only to answer the discussion forum question for your attendance, but to at the very least read your classmates' responses, because all of that information together will be helping you in terms of delivering not just your first speech, but all of your speeches. So all of that is supposed to simulate what we would normally be doing in class if we were having class conversations. So that said, the practice sessions also become a little bit more problematic. So what I thought might make the most sense is that if each of you could contact me to set up some sort of Zoom or phone session with me individually, and I would count that as your practice session. Not that you necessarily have to deliver your speech in this practice session, but I did want to touch base with each of you, either via Zoom or phone, to get a sense as to how things are going with your first speech, if you need any help with your first speech. And also, this is an opportunity for you, if you wanted to try out anything with your first speech, we could do that as well. So again, the way to contact me is email, and that would be Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, letting me know if you would like to have a Zoom session or a phone session, and when some of your times of availability are over the next few days, and then we can set up a time for a brief chat and any practicing that you might want to do. And all of that should occur before Tuesday, which is the 4th of August, because that's when ultimately you will be delivering your first speech, whether you be uploading your video of your speech on that date, or whether we've decided on a Zoom time that is convenient for all of us, and then you can present via Zoom. And there are pros and cons to each, so considering the fact that we live in very uncertain times, I wanted to try to be as flexible as possible to accommodate what your schedules might be dictating at this particular point in time. So, in relation to thinking about today's attendance question, it is going to be related to 3 videos that I have posted above in our notes. And what I've done is I've selected 3 speeches on YouTube, sample student autobiographical speeches for you to view. Now, normally I would show the first 2 speeches in class, and then the third speech I would stream from another site, but it turns out that there's some mechanical difficulties with that, so I needed to choose a third video from YouTube for us to watch. These are students who have uploaded their speeches, in no way affiliated with GCC, so we don't need to worry about the idea that one day you might be appearing in a class for your speeches. We can't necessarily evaluate these speeches on some of the criteria for this particular class. For instance, I've asked you to have a 5-minute speech. Some of these speeches are under or over, and again, they weren't necessarily presenting their speech with that criteria, so we can't necessarily judge them on that. Volume is something else we can't necessarily judge them on, because it'll be based on the recording, and we can obviously raise and lower the volume accordingly. But that said, we can evaluate the speeches in other ways, based on everything that we've talked about in terms of speeches. And today's attendance question is for you to, after you've watched all 3 of these speeches, to list 1 strength and 1 weakness for each of the speeches. So a strength and weakness for speech number 1, a strength and a weakness for speech number 2, and a strength and a weakness for speech number 3 in our discussion forum. And that will serve as your attendance for today. And I encourage you to read the responses of your classmates at the very least, because that's what we would have been doing in class if we were having a class conversation. And certainly you can interact if you'd like with your classmates. I think of that much like raising your hand in class if you so decided to do that. The speech that I would have streamed that I'm unable to had 2 versions of the same speech, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to show it, to show that you can never deliver the same speech twice. There are always changes, and that's perfectly fine. And it's also a speech where the speaker in his first version doesn't necessarily mention a piece of very sensitive information that he mentions in his second take of that speech, where in the second take of his speech he talks about his sexual orientation. But he does so in a very professional way, and I use that as an illustration to indicate that you can talk about sensitive topics if you so want to in your speech, because you're working with a group of adults. That said, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's professional and appropriate and respectful. However, you can see with the other two speeches, the first two speeches that I've assigned, they don't necessarily get into specific details about their personal lives very much, and I deliberately show those two speeches to indicate that you too do not necessarily have to share sensitive information if you don't feel comfortable doing so. So you can keep it general, and if you're not necessarily sure how to proceed, then certainly one of the things that you can do is to talk about education in one way or another. But this is a great way too for us to have a conversation in that practice session, whether we meet via Zoom or we talk on the telephone. What is some of your thinking about that speech and how you think you would like to proceed? So you've got 3 sample autobiographical speeches to watch on YouTube, and one of the great things about YouTube is that it'll generate similar content. So you will see multiple autobiographical speeches there as well that you could access if you so wanted to give you some ideas. So that pretty much does it for today's class, with my leaving you with some sample speeches to watch, and you're needing to contact me if you haven't already done so, to indicate that if you want to upload your speech on the 4th of August, or you want to have a Zoom of your speech, and if so, if you want to have a Zoom, what times of availability would you have on August 4th? Some of you have already contacted me, so you don't need to do that. But if you haven't contacted me to do that, please do so. And all of you contacting me about what makes sense in terms of our having a conversation either via Zoom or phone about your upcoming speech, and that should be done before the 4th of August so that I can help you in whatever way I can in terms of that speech, and I'm calling that our practice session. So I hope you're well, I'm well, and I'll talk to you soon, so to speak. Take care. Bye-bye.